Hello and welcome to another episode of the Vehicle Network podcast. And in this episode, I'm excited to announce we have Andrea Amico. I am correcting the pronunciation, hopefully, of Andrea's name there. And Andrea is somebody that I've been wanting to catch up with for a good number of years. So I thought, what better way to do it than on a podcast, and we can share this with a wider network of people that are interested in automotive investigations. I'm not going to steal Andrea's thunder. I'm going to hand it over to him to introduce himself and just tell us who he is, where he's come from, and what he's doing at the moment. So over to you, Andrea, if you don't mind.
Thank you, Noel, and thank you for having me here today. I look forward to today's conversation. My name is Andrea Amico. You pronounce it great. So you're doing already fantastic seeing this episode. And I am the founder of a company called Privacy for Cars. And Privacy for Cars is the first, I still think the only privacy tech company that is really focused on data collected by cars. And so we create all sorts of solutions to create protections for the data that cars collect and nowadays send. And I'm sure that we're going to be talking about this today. And of course, it has a lot of applications, I think, for your audience, because it includes, I think, mainly law enforcement and insurance companies. And so we can talk about the capabilities of cars and what are some new crimes we're starting to see, which, we predicted was going to happen. And unfortunately, surprise, surprise, human beings are human beings. And hopefully provide some insights to your audience on what are some things to watch for. And yeah, hopefully it's a good discussion.
Yeah. So
Thank
do
you
you
for having me.
have a background in vehicles then, or is it more information and data?
Yeah, so I've been told before by a number of automakers and other companies I like to stick my nose where it doesn't belong. So that's my background. But more seriously, I'm an engineer. I'm pretty hands-on with technical stuff. I always like tinkering with things.
Yeah.
And I've been in automotive for more than a decade now. And my old company, one of the business units I was managing was a very large used car inspection company.
Okay.
And so we went through, we inspected cars for damages, right? Nothing to do with forensics. And then two of my customers were under investigation by a regulator over how they were treating consumer data. Of course, nothing to do with cars, right?
No.
But again, like to stick my nose where it doesn't belong. I said, hey, why don't we do an audit and see what kind of data is in their cars, right?
Yeah.
And I think I'm still credited with doing the first statistical study in the industry, because people kind of thought that cars had data, but nobody had any idea of what data was in there, how often is it left behind, is it the same if it's a rent or if it's a lease return or whatever else, right? So we were the first to kind of create a statistical analysis of that. And we repeat those stats every year. And I'm sure your audience is not surprised to hear this. The numbers get worse and worse every year. And by worse, I mean a higher and higher percentage of vehicles exchange hands containing data. And the amount of data they contain is becoming larger and larger. So you have both trends, going up over time.
That's really relevant because, the number of, people that are just hiring cars now as opposed to owning cars, I think is going to be on the increase more and more as people look to come away from vehicle ownership in its own right and use a vehicle as a service rather than actually own one because it's going to be more cost effective. But we also see a lot of people, hiring cars that are used in crime as well, and they can go through, many different hands. And of course, as you allude to and point out there, each hirer then is potentially leaving a footprint of their personal data in that one piece of equipment that, how do we then segregate all that? And it can cause a real headache for consumers and for people managing those vehicles as well, as somebody that's in charge of a hire company or a fleet, a company fleet, for example, that's using that one car's being used by different members of staff. And each member of staff is looking to, either pair their device or use some of the convenience features that are imposed on drivers in order to make them safe. But as a byproduct, they're leaving that sort of footprint of personal data behind. So it is really relevant. Can you tell me a little bit more about the privacy for cars then, and what solutions you've got for people to, make sure that their personal data is not left behind if they are?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Now I'm going to be splitting your audience in half because people in law enforcement are going to start to freak out with, oh my gosh, wait, you're destroying my evidence. And then people in insurance start to think, is this helpful to me or not? So what we do is actually we help companies deleting the personal information stored in cars. That's what most companies use us for. We have a brand new breed of a series of services that tackle the connected car, and in short, we are creating the disconnected car. And yeah, so that's what we do. And my footprint today is very, very heavy: United States and Canada. We work with a lot of companies, and most auto finance companies, and you were mentioning most fleet management companies, etc. They use our service because their concern is, I'm a pharmaceutical company. Do I really want my routes of all the hospitals where I went to and all the text messages exchanged with doctors to be left behind? And yes or no, you don't, right?
No.
And so while to address the law enforcement side of your audience, while yes, we do reduce the footprint, we actually think it is a good thing because unfortunately we start to see a growing amount of exploitation that is happening in the wild of people using data left in cars. And so I think you need to freak out less about, wait, hold on, are you destroying my evidence? And I think you should be really cherishing the fact that we're trying to reduce the data footprint of people, which cybercrime is probably the fastest crime growing, right? And now it's starting to tackle cars because, surprise to no one, cars are essentially large networks of computers that just happen to have tires so the computers don't drag on the ground. But, that's what they are.
Yeah. Yeah, and some really valid points. I think when you say you're going to split the audience in half, and the law enforcement are going to say, "Oh, you're destroying, or reducing my opportunities," it's probably certainly in the group of people that I engage with, it's a little bit of a white elephant in the room around this. We know that cars are collecting data, and maybe we don't want to lose those opportunities that are on a vehicle. But I don't think many people, me included, will have really thought about it in the way that you explain there, that the cars can, if law enforcement are exploiting the vehicles for data, shall we say, and to use that in an investigation, then other people will be aware of some of those techniques in order to do that, as you point out, to facilitate crime. So the vehicle, as you say, by reducing the data that's on there, inadvertently might reduce other crime types being committed by people obtaining personal data. And certainly from vehicle fleets where you've got staff working in those vehicles that have sensitive information, so border forces, national security vehicles in either law enforcement themselves or in the armed forces, then we need to make sure that those vehicles are not being exploited that could be a risk for national security. So some really good points.
There was maybe 5 years ago, somebody put on Craigslist, which is an online marketplace. I don't know if you have it in Europe too, right? But it's where people, post stuff and sell it, like, qualified ads. Somebody posted on Craigslist that they were selling now President, back then Senator Biden's car.
Yeah.
And they knew it was Senator Biden's car because, in the infotainment list, there was Jill's number and, all their contacts, all their destinations. And back then, the car sold for $5,000 above what was a normal market price for that type of Cadillac, right?
Yeah.
So now we know the Rolodex of the president is worth $5,000. I think it's a great deal. But, the question is, should something like this really happen? And I think the answer is no, it shouldn't, right?
No.
And again, that's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek case here. But again, unfortunately, we start to be aware of people showing up at people's homes and doing home invasions, or now there's cases that are going through courts of horrible cases of harassment and people being harmed through cars technology. And I don't know that most people in law enforcement really have thought about that, how
No.
people can weaponize a car.
Yeah. It's a valid point that I think the automotive industry is moving at such a rate and pace that, we're only just catching up with what we can do and what we know data, what data is being stored on cars, without thinking about the next phase of how that can have an implication on different crime types that are committed and, the risk to exploiting that personal data for criminal activities. It's something that we need to be on top of, and just by having this conversation with you already, my mind's starting to jump forward to certain scenarios that could occur and that can potentially occur going forward, that we need to be careful and need to minimize those. And I think from examining the vehicle from our perspective as an independent company, perhaps that's working a lot on behalf of law enforcement, whereby we are asked to look at a vehicle and acquire data from an investigation point of view, it can and it does throw up a lot of questions over what authority am I acting under to get this data, and if we are going to look at, say, a hire car that's been through the hands of many hirers before the time of interest and maybe since the time of interest, because the vehicle might have been rehired out.
Mm-hmm.
What law and what legislation are we acting under when A, we're examining the vehicle, and B, what are we doing with the information that we acquire? Because in most cases, we can't just say, I want between that time and that time. We might get a whole chip image of what's being stored on the vehicle.
Yeah.
And it just has so many potential ramifications down the line that I don't think many people have really thought out fully as to it. I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so let's simplify the discussion for the time being, if you don't mind, right? So let's take the cars until 10 years ago. Essentially, the car is a giant hard drive with 4 tires on it, right? And there's really 2 boxes that are of interest for law enforcement. One is the electronic data recorder, the EDR. The other one is the infotainment plus some other ECUs that are scattered around the car, but it's mainly the infotainment, right? So those are the 2 main boxes of interest for investigations. So I'm not sure what the regulation is for EDRs in Europe, to be frank. In the United States, there's a law that was written in 2015. It's called the Driver's Privacy Act, and essentially says it is unlawful to extract any data from the EDR unless, and there's a list of exceptions. Essentially, the list of exceptions is you need to have a court order, you need to have a warrant, you need to have the permission of the owner, or there's a few, some edge scenarios, cases of national security and, whatever else.
Yeah.
That law is actually survived the test of the courts, meaning that, sometimes law enforcement has taken data out, and now there's an established body of law and decisions by courts, at least again in the United States, on the fact that evidence that is collected unlawfully is thrown out. And so, it's just a very poor idea to not follow the law, because then you end up with potentially important evidence that cannot be admitted to court, right? So I'm sure everybody knows this, but, just follow the rules. For the EDR, that's the story. Now, there are 2 big loopholes with the EDR, and we can get to that into later if you want. The other one really is the infotainment, really, anything else. So I'm sure that the modern car nowadays is somewhere, around 100 ECUs in it.
Yeah.
One is regulated, which means, now we got 99 problems. And,
Yeah.
how do we deal with that?
Yeah.
And that poses, a series of challenges, right? Back to what you were saying, I am extracting data from a car, and the car may contain data of, not just one person, but multiple people.
Yeah.
And one person is the person of interest. What is the appropriate treatment to be in compliance with the law? In Europe, it's mainly GDPR and e-privacy, right? Because cars are terminal equipment. what we need to do with that. And I think that the technical answer is, well, you can't really lawfully collect that data, right? But because it's not a person of interest, right? So they're not subject to the same warrants or whatever other legal proceeding you have, right? So as far as I know, though, the main tool that is used, which is, again, let's separate the DDR, because DDR has a very short time frame, right? As you know, right? You smack a car, you have a few seconds before, a few seconds after. Chances are the person of interest was in the car, right? And so, you really don't have that issue. The problem is, infotainment, some of them collect data for 2 or 3 years. And, potentially you have a lot of people in it, especially if it's a rental car, you may have, 100 people's data in it. And so, as far as I understand, the main tool for extracting data is the tool made by Berla. And I don't believe that Berla has built any safeguards into it to say, we have there's 5 phones synced, right? Which ones do I blur because they're not? And then, I can unblur them once I get the appropriate legal, authorizations. There's no such feature in it. And,
there are some,
community, right? But the reality is that will create problem, because there will be cases in court in which somebody's going to say, well, now I have collateral damage of potentially tens of people whose data has been exposed during an investigation where they were not subject to the investigation.
I think that's more down to data management in a prosecution as to what's disclosed and what's not. A lot of software companies that are extracting data from computer devices, Berla included, can't potentially pick and choose, because investigators don't know what's relevant until everything is reviewed. Their software does have the ability for the user to just limit timeframes down, so that what comes out as a product is potentially only relevant to the investigation, and the other stuff does sit in there. But the original acquisition, does take all that.
Right.
I think sometimes the difficulty shifting it a little bit from law enforcement is into the insurance sector side of things, and how is that going to be received in a civil case? And certainly here in the UK, it's again, it's cases are popping up here and there that it's being used, but there doesn't appear to be any sort of regulation around it, and people are just sort of stretching the boundaries with it, as I suppose they should. But until, as you allude to, sort of in the EDR side of things, where there is some regulation around it, then we're going to be sort of testing these things out. But it's the management of that data, I guess, that's critical to ensure that it's collected in the right manner.
And as I was saying, right, the EDR, even though, and again, I'm sorry, my expertise is mainly on the law for the EDR, is essentially the United States. I'm not sure how it's regulated in Europe, but there's 2 major loopholes, right? Because one of the provisions of the law is that the owner can give you permission, right? You don't need a warrant if you get the owner permission. So that means that if I say I rent a car, right? I am the person at legal jeopardy, right? Because the case is about me, but I actually have no say, right? And so this creates an interesting tension in which the owner may be somebody that has absolutely not the best interest of the subject, in their mind. And I think it's pretty common to expect that any rental company will essentially roll over and give the data, right? And I think that poses some questions about, are we living by the spirit of the law or not? And again, I think that's an interesting thing. The other one, specifically for insurance, right? The big loophole is that if in the United States, if say you have an accident, the owner says that they do not wish to relinquish the data for whatever reason, you cannot get a court order, right? All you need to do is for the check to clear between the insurance company and the person. Because then at that point, right, once the insurance company has settled the claim, the paper moves under the insurance. So now you can go to an insurance company and say, hey, you're the owner. Can I have DDR data?
Yeah.
And again, I expect that the insurance company is going to say, sure, because, we don't want to obstruct, any legal proceeding.
Yeah.
And so now you have found the perfect loophole, because every car eventually gets, all cars are supposed to be insured, right? So eventually there is an insurance company to go and knock at the door and get data, and bypassing the process that was originally designed by whoever wrote the law, right? So I think that that's something to be aware of. And, I know that just by saying it, now I'm creating a double jeopardy, right? Because from one side, now there's going to be probably somebody in the audience that will think, oh, now I know how to crack my case. I'll just go to the insurance company because I couldn't get a warrant.
Yeah.
And, at the same time, then I think, hopefully there's going to be people in the audience who will ask themselves, well, if I couldn't get a warrant and people didn't determine that this was not evidence should have been admitted, is it okay for me to use a back door, right?
Yeah.
And similarly, again, for the infotainment data, there's a lot of protections for people's phone, right? You cannot just go through people's phone without doing certain things. But, these things nowadays are pretty much locked up, right? At the factory, they come with encryption, and it's can you get through it? Yes, as you know, there's a lot of tools, but they're a pain in the ass.
Yeah.
And it's just a lot easier to go through an unencrypted hard drive that is attached to the car, and where people, by and large, were not even aware that all this data had been transferred, right?
Yeah.
And so again, I think that there's a tension here between what's the letter of the law and what's the spirit of the law, and what's the right thing to do.
Interesting. Linking on from what you've just said there around smartphones, do you think there's a little bit more onus needs to be on the manufacturers of vehicles to make people more aware around the fact that the vehicles, what they store? I mean, when you drill down into some of the infotainment head units and data privacy screens that are buried maybe at the far end of a settings menu, certainly on one I was looking at the other day, it is kind of all there, but it's there as we've thought about it and we've put it in there, but maybe the consumer's not fully aware of its contents. And should there be coming from
well, I don't know. I have very strong views on this, right? I mean, again, we're talking to a European audience, so let me use the framing of GDPR, right? GDPR says you need to have privacy by design and by default. I don't know how anybody will look at the data collection of the infotainment and say that they're meeting even remotely that requirement, right? And in fact, most people are, I think even the consent model is absolutely broken, right? In the US, where the bar is much lower, right? Where as long as you get consent, you can essentially do whatever you want, right? Yeah. But the problem is my consent was a little pop-up that says, I want to share my contacts, yes or no. It never said to me, oh, by the way, your text message database has just been sucked out and now it's in the clear. Oh, by the way, I know what apps are running on your phone. Oh, by the way, I have a track record of the last 100 files that you downloaded from the email because, now it's part of all the metadata. And so I think even the consent is not there. Like the legal notification is not even there. So there's a lot of progress that needs to be made in how these systems are designed, frankly. And the fact that, you're essentially, I'm aware of maybe less than 10 cars that have encryption. Half of them are from Tesla. And I'm sure you know that the Tesla encryption has been broken twice. Last time was maybe 3 or 4 months ago, right? So, again, is it okay from a cybersecurity hygiene standpoint to put millions of devices on the road every year where the basic, data should be encrypted at rest and in transit is not happening?
No.
So,
And the way that vehicles are going with this connection to the smartphone and I like to call it the vehicle ecosystem of the sort of digital side of things, really, in the sense that the lines are starting to become a little bit blurred from what is on the phone to what is on the infotainment unit with regards to how much can come over there, notwithstanding some of the safety requirements that people don't want to be distracted by having the full capabilities of a smart device in the vehicle. But that's running alongside the technologies that are being developed for autonomous driving, for which the more autonomy we get, the more features will come over from the smartphone and be available on the vehicle, but that also opens up the opportunities for personal data to go elsewhere, not just on the vehicle itself and the components, but into the cloud and to the manufacturer themselves.
That is an excellent observation. So I was speaking with somebody else in the forensic world just a few weeks ago, and what the phrase I use to describe this is think outside the box. And by the box, I mean the EDR box and the IVI box.
Yeah,
there's a lot of stuff that is outside those boxes.
Yeah,
That is potentially of interest to your audience, right?
Yeah.
Considering to consumers, right?
Yes.
But the equivalent that I always think about is, you remember the flashlight app, right? I want to use the flashlight, but I'm going to be sucking out, your contacts, your telemetry, and all of that, and there's been a lot of cases where law enforcement went to those app manufacturers and app writers and producers, and essentially subpoenaed and asked for the data, and they were able to get data out of something that was completely unrelated, right? And the car is full of flashlight apps.
Yeah.
Right now, I am tracking, maybe 500-600 companies that get data from cars directly or indirectly. And I think that that's something that very few people think about, which is, even if I have no physical access to a car, right? Take extreme cases. The car has disappeared. The car has burned down to a crisp, and all the physical components are absolutely gone, and you can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
There is still a massive footprint with the right car outside of the car. And there's a lot of places where you can go and look. And an obvious one is, of course, the manufacturers. But again, there's many other places where you can go to.
Yeah.
And I don't think that, by and large, people in law enforcement really think about that.
No. You're right about that. When I was looking at some of your stuff for this podcast, just to see what you were doing, that led me into some of those areas around some of the data types that are going off cars, and I shared a post on LinkedIn to somewhere the other day. We've just lost Andrea. Hopefully he will come back in a minute or two, and he'll be asking to join, but it looks as though he's gone off the link. He's back.
Did you get the full sentence here, or you did not?
You disappeared for about 10 seconds, so don't worry.
Okay.
The data points that were on a vehicle for a company that were dealing with connected car data, there were, I think, 245 different data points that they would potentially process off a connected vehicle, from battery status to, can't remember, many off the top of my head, but there was just so much information from the 245 points that could be going off the vehicle as well. And I guess the lines seem also blurred between those third-party data handlers and the manufacturer, as well, as to who owns the data, who's responsible for processing it, and where is my personal data going in regards to the ownership or use of a vehicle.
Yeah, I mean, from a consumer standpoint, it's an absolute rat's nest, right? Because you will never know where your data is gone. Again, we spend a lot of time thinking about it. I think we're just scratching the surface with 500 or 600 companies.
Yeah.
From a law enforcement standpoint, I think it's important for law enforcement to really start to think about two things. One is, I have a case and I'm trying to find alternative sources of data. Where can I go?
Yeah.
And the other one is, there is a crime and the car does not usually make it in the short list of suspects, but there's plenty of crimes you can commit with cars, right? So, and there are simple things that a law enforcement officer or an insurance, investigator can do to actually shed some light on certain things happening. So let me give you some example, right? Because we work a lot with repossession companies, right? So you don't pay your bills, right? And the bank repossesses the car. They come, they track you and they try to find you, and then they take the car, right?
Yep.
And it's a very dangerous job. I don't think people really understand how dangerous that is. And in the last few months, there's been a series of arson cases in which cars would be set on fires at the lots of these repossession companies.
Yeah.
And the first thing I thought about, because again, I'm me and I think about this stuff all the time, is, well, if they took my car, how in the world would I know which tiny little, 100-meter by 100-meter property in a 50-mile radius has my car? How the hell do I know that, right? And the easiest thing for you to do is to actually pull up your phone, right? Open the app of the manufacturer, because now most cars have an app, right?
Yeah.
And you press locate, and then now you know where you can go and throw a Molotov, right? And I just don't know that anybody in law enforcement even thought about, oh, there's an arson case. Let me go and ping the manufacturer and say, hey, I would like to get, has there been any activity on your mobile app, on your telematics, in the 2 hours before and the 2 hours after what we think is the time of the accident? And I think if law enforcement started to do that, it would actually uncover probably a lot of cases where today it seems like, you would go on a tangent on, for a very long time, where instead you will be able to pinpoint who the responsible is very, very quickly.
Yeah.
Just 3 months ago, I heard that somebody was murdered because they tracked down the car that was repossessed, and same thing, right? And so hopefully, again, people in the audience will start to think about the fact that there are some very simple data trails that you can go and inquire on. And the manufacturer is the most obvious place to go to for those kind of simple things.
Yeah.
But if you exhaust those paths, there's a lot of other paths.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's a conversation that is happening in the background with law enforcement and the manufacturers, similar to what has happened previously with, say, the telecoms network, when police have been looking for, getting personal data of phone calls that have been made on their network. But there has to be a sort of coming together and a bit of a standardization around that. I think that the problem is the dysfunctional family, shall we say, of the automotive industry being managed by various different companies globally, and then it's how you pull all that together for your particular sector. Because us in the UK, we've not many manufacturers in this country, one or two perhaps, and then some of the popular vehicles that are involved in offences, we're looking to other countries that are holding the data, which then creates problems with applying for that data as it does in mobile devices. And if we're wanting to get data from, say, Snapchat or other social media apps that are somewhere else in the world, those sometimes can cause a little bit of difficulty for people to do that. But I think it needs to be done, because there's a lot of information there that could assist that side of things. But in tandem with that, I think the manufacturers also owe some more responsibility to the consumer to protect them. And they have that vying need as well of keeping their data secure so it can't be exploited by people that then can weaponize the vehicle, as you say, for other crime types.
Well, so within that topic, though, right? Because there's always a variety of cases, right? And so some of the easier ones where you can get your feet wet, right? If you are in law enforcement or investigation and you want to try to use these alternative sources of data, going with domestics is probably an easier path. There's a number of data brokers that collect data from cars that are domestic to you. So even if you don't go to the manufacturer, that's another path. And then there's a number of cases in which the owner actually would like to help with the investigation, right? And if you start from those, because those are much less controversial, right? If I am the consumer, it was my asset, is being used to do something, a criminal activity that is damaging me. Do I, as a consumer, have the right to request certain data? Absolutely, you do, especially in Europe, right? And so That will be an easy way to start to learn about where data is and what kind of data is there. And again, I think you'll be surprised by how many places, how many doors you can knock at. And I understand that every time you knock at a door, it's processed in time. And some doors are more promising than others. But I think that's why I'm saying, starting with when the consumer has a vested interest in solving the crime is a great testing ground for learning things.
Yeah. I think that is a good tip, and I'm critical of myself here because I've spent a lot of time using a particular brand of vehicle and their application, but I've yet to get around to making the personal request about what data is held about me in doing that use of the app and the vehicle at the time. But for those people that do have an interest that are listening, it's a valid point that Andrea makes, in the sense that use these things and go as a consumer and see where you get with regards to what information is there and what's held and how easy it is for you as a consumer, because that might, like you say, just make it an easier door to knock on your next investigation with regards to getting some vehicle data that previously you may be not aware how easy it was to get and what was held in those circumstances.
Yeah. And, I'll make an offer to your audience, which is that if you do have cases where there is a consumer that is asking to have access to the data and you want to try to figure out where the data may be and what are some tricks, because we do this a lot.
Yeah.
And we learned a lot through a lot of pain and experience.
Yeah.
Please reach out, and as long as you have consumer consent, we may be able to help you out.
Great stuff. And I think just to wrap up, really, the car is becoming, from those infotainment systems that are blurred with our mobile devices. When did you have a pin on your phone 10 years ago or 12 years ago? You probably didn't. When did you have one on your car's infotainment system? You probably haven't. The majority of this audience probably haven't got a pin on their infotainment system, but half of them probably could put one on if they got to the right user setting. But I think you will see that rapidly evolve and probably miss out the pin to biometrics, like you say, either facial or fingerprint, with other features that are in the vehicle that make that accessible. But in order to do that, manufacturers are pushing you down, creating these counts and these apps whereby when I get in the vehicle, it's on my personal data within the infotainment system, that when Andrea gets in the vehicle later on, he can't see all my personal information from a user perspective, and they are starting to partition things off into those user profiles. Perhaps a sinister part of me says that that's for marketing as well. Once they've got all those personal details, and they will be using it. But I think we're starting to see those steps of closing things down from a user perspective to show a little bit of willing on the manufacturer's behalf with regards to privacy.
Yeah, we're starting to see some of it, but I don't think this is really going at anywhere near any significant speed.
No.
Right?
No.
I mean, reality is that manufacturers right now are very busy trying to comply with a number of cybersecurity laws.
Yeah.
And that's where the attention is going, which is why I often say that privacy in vehicles is the ugly duckling, right? Everybody thinks it's literally the ugliest thing, and nobody wants to do anything about it. I happen to believe that privacy will be a fundamental value proposition for cars, just like 30 years ago, safety nobody cared about.
Yeah.
Right? Manufacturers looked at safety as it's a cost. I need to put more steel in my doors. I need to install airbags. Well, why would I do that, right? Because nobody was asking them questions. And then what happened is that, interestingly for your audience, right, it was the insurance companies that started this movement of making safety a feature because they were carrying the actual cost. I mean, who was carrying the cost were the consumers who were getting hurt, and the insurance companies that were, paying money, right, to obviate to frankly poor design.
Yeah.
And, nowadays, instead is, it's the opposite, right? People get awards on their best safety features. Yeah. And, last year manufacturers went to regulators and say, hey, we want to include ADAS into the safety criteria. I think the same is going to happen with privacy. And the reason is because I hear a lot of people talking about how the car is a smartphone. And
Yeah.
when I hear that, I always ask them, so who's going to be the Apple of cars?
Yeah.
Because Apple spends an ungodly large amount of hundreds of millions of dollars a year in telling people how their value proposition, they're going to keep their data private.
Yeah.
And there's not a single manufacturer that's taken the step. And
No.
it's the same blueprint that Volvo followed years ago with safety. And still today,
Yeah.
people think that Volvo is the safest car out there, even though it's not anymore, right?
Mm.
But I think that there's some, if not out of, social justice or, compliance with the law, I think that eventually some manufacturer is going to figure out that this is a good thing for their bottom line to have a different
Yeah.
value proposition than anybody else. So we'll see. I'm hopeful that we can be part of that movement.
Absolutely. And, like you said, just to reiterate a couple of points there, Apple selling their devices and adverts centered around privacy. Not too long ago, 12, 18 months ago, their advert, certainly here in the UK, was privacy and highlighting all the personal information that's on your device. We want to see a manufacturer doing something similar. And then, yes, NCAP safety ratings, but data safety ratings for your personal data on a vehicle as well could be a feature that makes somebody sway towards one vehicle versus another, as it might do with a smartphone at the moment. Right, I know you push for time, Andrea. I'm just going to ask you a few questions that we always wrap up with. I don't know if you've had to consider these. What do you wish you knew before you started in your industry? Your hindsight could be the listener's foresight. Is there anything you can say to that?
I wish I thought earlier about the ramification of the fact that cars are connected and in how many places your data is going. And I think that's very rare. I think it's a great foresight for your audience.
Yeah.
Because if they think, back to my expression before, if they think more outside of the boxes, of the two boxes, I think a lot of possibilities will open up in front of their eyes.
Great stuff. Can you give us an example when you failed and how did you overcome it? We love failure on the Vehicle Network because if you're not failing, you're not learning.
Yeah, I think that's about right. I think 100% of the things I learned in my life is because I screwed up something in the process, and I try to not make the same mistake twice, and sometimes I fail at that too, right? So
that's the best one we've had, I think. Fail twice.
It's just what it is, right? You learn through mistakes, and you try to do your best to not make the same mistake again. But for instance, all these discovery that we have done over vulnerabilities in cars and basic issues of privacy and security that really spun out of poor design, all of those are mistakes. And I think that people that design systems have made mistakes. I think I've made mistakes in how I've handled certain things. I'm always very, very cautious, and I try to give the benefit of the doubt to companies and give them the opportunity to fix things. But there's a vehicle hack that we disclosed now 4 years ago that still hasn't been fixed.
No.
Because it's not in the eyes of the regulators. It's not an immediate safety threat to people. I think it has massive privacy implications, and nobody's fixing it. So I'm still thinking about do I need to change my postures there? But again, I'm really extra cautious because I also don't want to. I don't want to be the next person that tells people how to stick a USB, stick into the key and the units and steal them, right? So I don't want to give ideas to anybody at the same time. So, I make plenty of mistakes, so probably on how I handle those things. Hopefully, our heart is in the right place. Hopefully, we'll do better over time.
Yeah. Tell me one recommended resource you could point the listeners to.
Us, again, if you are trying to think about what are possible sources of data, again, the one constraint we will put is that as long as there's consumer consent, because our ultimate audience is protecting consumers, we'd be more than happy to help you out. So the website is Privacy for Cars, which is spelled privacy number 4 cars. There's a contact us form, and you need help, just send us a note.
Great stuff. We'll add that into the lesson for people as well, with your contact details on. Are there any myths about your industry that you wish to debug?
Oh my God, I I often talk about this, how we live in a world of mythology. You have no idea how many times I speak with people who have been in the industry for a very, very long time. Like when I was a baby, they were in the industry, right?
Yeah.
And they have no idea how cars work. And, I mean, let's take some similar example, right? So people tell me, oh, but I use Android Auto, so my data doesn't move into the thing because all it does is to mirror my thing. And these are people actually are designing the system. Like that's not how it works. Not
No.
only the data moves from your phone into the car, but also now there's data from the car that moves to the phone. And guess what? Now Google has 120 plus data points per second about you, and these are the people that are in the industry. And so yes, we live in a world of myth. I see unicorns, but I actually do see that one that just ran behind me. That's that happens to me all day long, and
Yeah.
and it's kind of fun to help people connect the dots, because what I also realize is that the more I talk to people is that they never thought about certain things that I think are basic, but that's because I've been thinking about privacy because for 7 years. But as soon as you start to tell them things, everybody has a personal story. Oh my gosh, I remember when, I rented a car and there were 10 people's, phone calls in it. Or, oh, my cousin just bought a car and, blah, blah, blah. I mean, you have no idea how many people, because people know that I have an interest in this.
Yeah.
I know new owners of celebrities' cars across the globe. Because literally people call me and say, hey, I have the car that was used to be owned by, fill the blanks on your favorite celebrity. And they know because the home of the mansion is there. They know what's their favorite restaurant. They have their cell phone. It's crazy, right? But they never thought about, they never connected the dots. So my hope is that we can help people connect the dots.
Brilliant. If you're in my shoes, what question would you ask yourself that I didn't?
No, I think that this was, first of all, I'm grateful for the opportunity. You talk to an audience that I do not speak enough to, hopefully. I think that insurance companies need to think also about, because we talked about a lot about how you take data to try to solve crimes, but in reality, there's a very heavy compliance burden that I don't think that insurance companies today are really meeting. And I think that they should really be thinking about not only using data for solving, crimes or, investigating things, but also how do you build your database in the first place to be in compliance with the law? What kind of disclosures you need to make to consumers? How do you minimize the data footprint under a number of conditions? And I think that insurance companies really haven't thought about this through.
No. Yeah. We're putting a playlist together for our guests that have been on the podcast that people might want to listen to while they're driving. What is your number one driving track, if you have one?
I don't. When I saw your question about the driving track, I thought you were inviting me to go to the Nürburgring and go and take a lap around. But that's not what you were asking. You were asking about what's my favorite music, right? So
yeah.
Well,
so I'll rephrase that question in the email. Yeah.
Well, so I don't have a favorite track, but I can tell you that Sirius XM, which is a very big satellite service for music, has started to install radios that have GPS trackers, because of course it's very important as you listen to the Beatles that you know where you are, right? So, and of course it's done for marketing purposes and all that. But so, to your audience, you can add, your satellite radio to the list of possible sources for geolocation.
I'll do for us.
I mean, these are the kind of things that I learn over time. So there you go.
Thank you. You've explained where you can find us where we can find you online. I'll put some details in the lesson. Listen, Andrea, thank you very much for your time today and your input. It's been a really refreshing conversation, and to tackle that white elephant in the room that sometimes we sort of walk around plenty of times and know that it's there, but you've certainly thrown up some things for me to think about, and I'm sure some of our audience as well. And hopefully at some point in the future, we'll be able to catch up in person and carry on the conversation as to where we are at in the future.
That'd be great. I look forward to it. And thank you again for having me here today. I appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you.
Bye.